All right, so just to recap here, again, we're looking at the Vietnam War from 1955 to 1975. Again, what we already went over, but the history of Vietnam, remember that they originally were under French imperial rule, and they were able to defeat the French imperial power and gain their independence. And when they gain that independence, they are then divided at the 17th parallel, and that happens at the Geneva Accords. They're divided similar to how Germany was divided after World War II, Korea was divided as well. So this was not abnormal at that time. When they did break into two, you had North Vietnam, which was communist and led by Ho Chi Minh. I remember he was the leader of the Viet Minh Party, and helping him were Viet Cong or the Viet Cong. These were those guerrilla warriors that we mentioned in the reading that you guys did about the Vietnam War. Remember, they used guerrilla warfare, sneak attacks, using kind of these underground tunnel systems, hiding in jungles, snipers, using landmines. All right, so those are the type of warriors that were fighting on behalf of Ho Chi Minh. You then have South Vietnam, which was democratic, so it was anti-communist, and it was led with American support, right? They had the Americans backing them up because we had pledged to help any country that felt as if they were being threatened by communism. All right, their leader Diem was assassinated. Again, the United States was not upset about that all that much because he was not a very strong leader or strong ruler. And the United States knew that if South Vietnam was going to be able to maintain its independence from North Vietnam and maintain its democratic stance, that they would need to have a strong leader that everybody could get behind. We then looked at the escalation of our time in Vietnam, I guess you could say, starting off, with that, the Truman Doctrine, again, pledging to give support to any nations that are threatened by communism. Of course, then it grows more and more with that. We have more and more military then that end up going to Vietnam. It starts with, military advisors, then you add more advisors, and then you're adding troops. You have the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. Remember as well, that is where Lyndon B. Johnson was granted this resolution by Congress to continue action in Vietnam. So there are a lot of things that we have already covered in this unit. Today, we're going to kind of wrap some of that up. As you learned by completing the stations, people at home in the United States were not all that supportive of the war. We were definitely divided at this time as a country, and we had a lot of anti-war protests happening on. And people protested in a variety of ways. You had draft resistors, so people who maybe burned their draft cards or attempted to move to a different country, who would go to college so they could defer their time in the military, really doing anything that they could to try to dodge the draft so that they didn't have to go fight in Vietnam. You have the Kent State Massacre happening where you have students protesting, with the National Guard there. You have people writing protest music and performing protest music. And then we also see the disrespect for veterans when they come home. There's a very anti-war feeling at home. And a big part of that then was, anti-soldier, anti-veteran movement as well. And they were very much disrespected when they came home. And you saw examples of that in the stations that you have looked at and worked on. Also in the stations, you learned a little bit about Richard Nixon and what he was really pushing or what his platform was while he was running for the presidency. So he is Republican, and he is able to defeat the Democratic nominee, Hubert H. Humphrey. And what he does is he really wins on this secret plan to get us out of Vietnam. This is very similar. We've talked about this a few times this semester, how politicians will say, I have a plan for this, or FDR said, I have a new deal, but he never really told us what it was before he get elected. It was the same idea with Nixon. We didn't really know what the secret plan to get out of Vietnam was until after he won the presidential election. So when it came down to it, Nixon's secret plan to get us out of Vietnam was known as Vietnamization. The idea with Vietnamization is that we would gradually remove our troops. We couldn't just remove our troops all at once. Obviously, that would be rather dangerous because the South Vietnamese would not be able to kind of hold their own and protect themselves. But the idea was that we would gradually remove that, make sure that we had trained their troops, trained their military to be able to take care of themselves, and then gradually remove troops from Vietnam. However, while that was happening, there were still these continued attacks on South Vietnam from the North Vietnamese. So at the Paris peace talks, you can see those lasted for over 5 years. These are the conclusions or decisions that were made there. Number one, the U.S. would remove all their troops within 60 days. All POWs would need to be released. The US would stop their military activities in Laos and Cambodia. We had been bombing them, believing that they were helping out the Viet Cong. So we started bombing those countries. So we would stop doing that. And that 17th parallel, that division line between North and South Vietnam, would remain there until they decided when they wanted to reunite. So if we take a look at the overall results in Vietnam, they're definitely not what the United States was used to. If you think about our involvement in wars prior to this, World War One, we join, we help, we win. World War Two, we join, we help, we win. Right? In Korea, we join, we help. It's more or less a draw. But in Vietnam, we really feel the sense that we more or less lost this war. So the United States, actually, all of the US troops left Vietnam by 1973. In 1975, the North Vietnamese continued to attack the South Vietnamese people. And with the absence of having American troops there to be able to help protect South Vietnam from North Vietnam, South Vietnam crumbles. So they end up losing the war. So on April 30th of 1975, that's the official date that South Vietnam actually surrenders. And North and South Vietnam then are united as one country, just known as Vietnam, and they're united under a communist system. Of course, when we look at this, people say, was it worth it? That's the big question. And with all the anti-war protests that have been happening in the United States during the Vietnam War, this is one of those reasons why. Is they were really questioning, why were we ever really involved, and was it worth it? If you look at the number of deaths, for example, was it worth it to go into this war and to maybe not really accomplish our goals? If our overall goal was to prevent the spread of communism, technically then we failed. So the question was it worth it? In looking at the end, what we're really looking at is the end of the Cold War, right? We had mentioned the Cold War, it starts, really right after World War II. So you're looking at 1945, right? So shortly after World War II, and lasts until the late 80s into the early 90s. So you're talking about 45 years worth of this tension between the United States and the Soviet Union. However, at this time, we seem to have the right people in leadership at the right time, with Ronald Reagan, who was the president of the United States, and then the Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev. They actually worked rather well with one another. They had this a little bit of a closer relationship, and both were very open to the idea of maybe bringing this Cold War to an end, kind of restructuring what the relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union had been for the past 45 years. When I mentioned we had the right people at the right time coming together with Reagan and Gorbachev, what we're really looking at is how Gorbachev changed what the Soviet Union would become in the future. He actually encouraged Eastern European nations and their leaders to open up their political systems, to maybe start to move away from communism, to look at their economic systems. And this was something completely unthinkable. I mean, after years of um, these countries being under, communist control, and these police states, really, you could look at it, that kind of silenced all their opposition. It was unheard of at the time that Gorbachev would now suggest that these Eastern European nations maybe be a little bit more open-minded. But as soon as he opened that door a little bit, you saw anti-communist movements realize that they'd been given hope that maybe communism could go away, and that Iron Curtain, right, that symbolic idea of the Cold War started to lift. We also then see that most significantly in Germany. And on November 9th of 1989, the East German government actually allows their citizens to travel to West Germany. This is the first time, obviously, since the country had been split into two, that we see that happen. So people were celebrating, people like took to the streets, families were united that hadn't seen each other for years. The final and most physical sign of the end of the Cold War is when the Berlin Wall actually comes down. The wall that had separated East Germany from West Germany for all of those years. Germany then formally was reunified in 1990. All right, so 45 years after they were split post World War II, they're now reunified into just one country. The Soviet Union itself, again, remember Gorbachev had been, encouraging leaders of those Eastern European nations, those that were part of the Soviet Union as well, kind of lessen some of those government restrictions. And he continues to try to reform the communist government himself as well, which kind of leads basically to the Soviet Union kind of dissolving and crumbling into just these loosely aligned states or countries with one another. And of course, those peace talks then continue. Peace talks looking at the idea of rules and regulations over nuclear weapons or atomic weapons, and go from there. And I think something really important, again, talking about the right people at the right time, is you can look at this quote by Gorbachev: the Cold War is now behind us. Let us not wrangle over who won it. The idea of this Cold War, this, not actually having military confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union, it's over. There's no use going back and saying, okay, well, who was the toughest during that time? Who had the most of that weapon, whatever it happens to be? It wasn't worth it at that point. It was just time to move on.